range DPS in M+. The meta has changed, people have their forset, and now we're in the third week of the Season 3 and the second week essentially of Fortified. Now we can probably tell exactly which specs are S tiers, which specs are bottom. And as always, we're gonna be starting it off with Affliction. Affliction Warlock is... it's F tier. Is this deja vu? Is this the last 2 years of Mythic Plus? Well, unfortunately, Affliction just is kind of the spec that just clears the smallest of all of the keys right now in Mythic Plus. Of course, this is still at the beginning of the season, so we don't know how this essentially will turn up. Because, I mean, at the end of the day, you know, just play whatever you want. But if you really want to know, Affliction can still pump a little bit of damage. You can probably see right now on the screen right now from... I think Murzon's Rise. Affliction doing 100 percentile parse, and I mean just look at Havoc and Red Paladin. Listen, yeah. So Affliction is fine, and we're gonna be moving on to Augmentation because let's stop being sad and be happy instead. And actually fill out both ends of the tier list with both S and F tier. Obviously, Augmentation right now is S tier. I don't think that's surprising anybody. And you might be thinking, but of course, because Augmentation is always going to be S tier. It hasn't been nerfed, although it has been nerfed. And it's been S tier last time, and it has been S tier last time. However, even though it is S tier, I don't think it's as strong as it was last season, or at the very least at the end of last season. It's also very hard to kind of judge Augmentation right now because, you know, its performance is, I mean, you can probably look at the screen right now in Everbloom as well, because obviously for the rankings, we look at the entire performance of the specs across all the Mythic dungeons. But in terms of like what we can show you guys in terms of performance, we're probably going to look at Murzon's Rise and Everbloom more, since these are the worst dungeons ranked, and usually these are the lowest keys that everybody does out of their repertoire. And if you can do Murzon's Rise and Everbloom, you can probably do any other dungeon in any other part of the week. But even with all of this, Augmentation in Everbloom and in Rise seems to be doing pretty well in terms of its own damage percentile. Now, obviously, Augmentation is usually paired really well with Havoc, but obviously it works really well with casters like Balanced Druid and Fire Mage as well, and it does decent numbers. Now, this is not everything that Augmentation does, of course, and logs are always a little bit iffy when it comes to kind of looking exactly what Augmentation is doing really well, because it does obviously way more than just damage, double dispels, defensive to tanks, a lot of CC and utility that actually is really good in like kind of 100% of the dungeons and affixes so far in the season. So it is a really complete spec. Maybe a little bit too complete, but we'll see how that turns out into the future. Because the future is bright, the future is orange. Orange like our Patreon logo. It's not our Patreon logo, but it is a Patreon logo, and the Patreon that we have obviously supports this video and a lot of other videos that we make. And if you want to support us a little bit more and you want to see more of this content, of course, and other content, and especially have exclusive access to early videos and custom-made wallpapers with your character on it, go ahead and check out patreon.com/MarcelianOnline. The link is down below. You'll obviously be supporting the team, and we'll be super grateful for it, and it will make it possible for us to do more videos, more cool videos on different cool topics. That's not just the tier list. Although tier lists are kind of fun, because fun is what Balanced Druid is. And as Marcelian would have it, Balanced Druid is my favorite spec. That's not really Marcelian, that's a fake Marcelian. However, Balanced Druid is actually really good. It is kind of A tier. I mean, that's not necessarily surprising, although maybe some people expected it to be S tier. It's obviously doing really good, but the top keys that are cleared with Augmentation don't usually have Balanced Druid in them, although that's very close. Probably since Augmentation and the very top keys, I think it's 26s at this point, clears them with melee DPS. So even though Balanced Druid is like a key behind Augmentation, I will put it into A tier, so it's a little bit lower. And it's still a good spec. I mean, you can look at on the screen right now, we have a log from, I believe it's a Balanced Druid performance with Augmentation in their team. I think this was Tettles. and he did pretty well. I mean, obviously it's Stealth, he knows what he's doing, but there's also Balanced Druid performing without Augmentation, and listen, it's still okay. It's still okay, and this is from some of the top keys cleared by Balanced Druids, period, which is kind of why I don't really want to put it into S tier, because obviously Augmentation is bumping balance by a little bit more than I am comfortable with making Balanced Druid S tier without the help of Augmentation. Arcane Mage has been pulling a lot of eyes and heads and turning things around. It's A tier, although I have been debating if this should be A tier or not, because Arcane still has some issues in terms of overall damage. Now, right now, in terms of overall performance, if you really look at blogs and whatever you want, you'll see Arcane Mage is doing really well. But in terms of the actual high keys that they're clearing, it's not very obvious, because although this applies with all of the other specs as well, but Arcane as well, people that are clearing the highest of keys don't actually log their keys, so we cannot really tell exactly how they're doing in the like 26s and 25s, right? So we only have access to like the next best thing, the logs that are about a key or two level below, and I mean, Arcane is doing pretty well. I mean, it's keeping up with Outlaw, it's keeping up with Demonology, which are some of the top specs in the game right now in Mythic Plus, so it's not that bad. It is a very difficult spec to play and very specific in terms of its rotation and what it needs to perform, which I don't think most or any other spec in the game has as many conditions tied to its overall damage output as Arcane does. But if you're running like a group without a Augmentation Evoker, Arcane is probably your next bet in terms of Bloodlust, that or Beast Mastery Hunter, which is the next on the list. And listen, Beast Mastery is way better than Arcane, but it's not really S tier either. It's really good. I mean, holy shit, this is a really good spec, dude. In terms of what Beastmasters are doing, fuck, dude. Like, we have some examples right here on the screen. So this is a run by Beast Mastery. I forgot what it was. It might have been either Neverbloom or a Murazan Rise. I think, judging from the number, it might have been a Murazan Rise, since Everbloom usually has bigger overalls. The overall of Beast Mastery is really big. I mean, obviously, it's top in the meters. Considering that a Fire Mage has a perfect parse just below it, you can probably imagine that Beast Mastery is pretty good. And it actually still has its niche, which is why I don't know 100% if it should be nerfed more. I mean, it's still doing a lot of damage, maybe a little bit too much damage, but if you really look at, let's say, Beast Mastery's damage on bosses, it starts to drop below that perfect parse mage, which is weird because you would think Beast Mastery has a lot of single target, but when it comes to Mythic Plus and you're going full AoE talents, you won't have that much boss damage, although the sheer number is still good, but dropping below Fire Mage kind of puts it out that the niche is most likely AoE, and yes, if you analyze, by the way, the data that you see on the screen is all from the exact same dungeon. It's just what you're looking at right now. This is trash damage for Beast Mastery Hunter, and you can see that it's doing a lot more than everybody else. Sure, both of these specs are propped up by Augmentation, but I assure you that the majority of Beast Mastery logs kind of look like this, and I just wanted to show you guys this one because it's just right next to a perfect parse Fire Mage, since Fire Mage is really close coming up into the list. Beast Mastery is good. It's a solid spec. It's why we recommend it in our KSM video, which you can check on our channel as well. And before we're moving to Demonology, I have made a big error. I want to put this in front of Balanced Druid because it actually matters. I don't think their performance comes even close. However, they are clearing similar keys. It's likely due to the fact that Druid has some utility that Beast Mastery does not, which is not a lot of extra utility, but it is utility. Now, Demonology is top of the A tier. This is as close to S tier without actually being S tier as you will be able to get. Demonology is really good. It's definitely the best Warlock spec. I mean, if you've been paying attention, you're probably not surprised by this, but Demonology is actually doing very good. You can see right now this is how kind of like a Demonology performs in an Everbloom. The overall is crazy. Now, sure, you may look at this and say, but it's not as big as Havoc's. Listen, nobody's overall is as big as Havoc Demon Hunters, okay? I think we already know that, and I think we can move past this and look at more Demonology performance, although still with Augmentation. But the overall numbers that it's dishing out, it is crazy, which is probably the only reason a Warlock spec would ever be picked in some of the top keys cleared ever, since although their utility is pretty good with Hellstones and Gates and all of that, it's not usually mandatory. It doesn't help clear content that much. Sure, your Imp might have a Dispel here and there, but without an augmentation in their team, which is what this particular team is running, you're not really short of the Dispels, and I don't know if the Dispel/Purge that Demonology has... Oh, wait a minute, you cannot even use that because you use a Felguard. What am I saying? Yeah, so, listen, it's fine. Demonology just brings damage, and that's really all you want from life. What else is there? And yes, I did say Demonology is the best Warlock spec because next on the list is Destruction, and... Listen, we're back to Destruction and Affliction sucking balls, and they're at the bottom of the list, although still they're doing pretty well. I mean, both Affliction and Destruction are clearing 20 keys. Affliction has probably the biggest gap in terms of its overall damage output, but if you look at the screen right now, Destro can actually really slap in Everbloom. It's doing really good damage, even with an augmentation in the group, and sure, it might not rise to the levels of Demonology and the 300k overall from Beast Mastery and other specs like that, but it's still doing respectable damage. Not always, but listen, it might still be able to keep up with Havoc, kinda, really. Listen, this Destruction that you see on the screen is obviously sweating a lot with the perfect parse, doing really big number. It's obviously leagues behind the majority of the other specs, clearly, and that's kind of why it's in C tier right now. Now, I kind of think that both F and C tier at the very least need buffs, like a lot of buffs, and until then, we're gonna, you know, move past that and go to Fire Mage. Now, Fire Mage is going to be tricky, and we're gonna go to Frost Mage as well. All of the mage specs are actually really good. It's kind of hard to judge all of them since some of the top mage players kind of play all of them. So I don't know how much it means that they've climbed to the top where they are with their respective specs, or got there with, like, I don't know, maybe let's say Arcane, and then they're swapping to Fire now that they have their force. Maybe Fire is just way overall better, and they're just doing it that way. It's kind of hard to tell. However, at the end of the day, Fire is actually clearing some of the highest keys ever, and it's still DPSing pretty well. The overall output is keeping up. I mean, we've seen the Beast Mastery log, and you can see this one as well with Fire Mage kind of keeping very close up to Beast Mastery, still behind Havoc, but that's, you know, the melee. We're not talking about the melee today, so it's not bad. It's probably a little bit more reliable, and to be fair, the single target that Fire Mage has is really needed. It actually helps a lot, especially on Tyrannical, since we've just came out of a Tyrannical week. This is probably why Fire is also so high, but listen, I think we can all agree that even on fortified weeks, some of these dungeons, especially, you know, Murzon's Rise and Everbloom, have the worst bosses ever, and you might want to Bloodlust even bosses on fortified week, which wouldn't be entirely surprising if you've played any amount of Mythic Plus. Frost Mage also similar. Now, it seems like it's doing slightly better than Arcane, but I think that's just in the last couple of days or the last week or so, because Arcane was usually slapping before. Now, Frost Mage is actually doing really well. It's actually keeping up with specs like Balanced Druid, although they're a little bit different in terms of the overall keys that they're doing. However, these are kind of like the top specs in some instances, and if you look on radar.io, the top mage in the top keys cleared is essentially a Frost Mage, and it's not necessarily a Fire, but overall more Fire Mages have done higher and higher keys. And a good example, and this is something that we say in pretty much all of our tier lists, is that, you know, just don't play meta. Just if you're looking for this for information, that's perfectly fine, but if you want to have fun, just practice and perform really well with your spec, because if you look at this particular log, you'll see this Frost Mage essentially out DPSing meta specs flavor of the month insanely, which is something that you don't really see every day, but definitely worth seeing every once in a while when people can actually just take their specs that are good. I mean, it's still A tier, but it's definitely not Demo or Havoc. And out DPSing these specs is really satisfying to watch. Marksmanship is also a little bit tricky to judge, because Marksmanship is not doing that bad, especially after getting your 4 set. However, I do probably believe that most Marksmanship hunters are actually playing Beastmaster, because Marksmanship is around C tier. And if you look at some of the top keys cleared, I mean, you can see a top 10 of Marksmanship. pretty much everybody's using power infusions, like 14 power infusions or something like that, which is crazy because it kind of makes it hard to kind of judge its overall performance. But when you go into, let's say, this particular marksmanship log that does not have, let's say, power infusions, I mean, the power infusions did not go on the marksmanship, it's still doing really good damage. It's likely that its BM is just keeping it back from actually, you know, rising up in the ranks, since BM is just, unfortunately, is just a superior spec. Where marksmanship always had the upper hand in AoE with AoE burst, now Beastmastery has taken that up, and it kind of cannibalized marksmanship's overall performance. It's doing a little bit better than Destro, probably a lot better than Destro. However, it's not doing better than the B tier specs, which not leaded by, but contributed with Devastation as well. Kind of a similar discussion between Augmentation and Devastation as we've had for the Hunter case as well. Devastation is not that bad. It's probably maybe way better than last season in terms of overall performance, but obviously it will always have something to contend with Augmentation when it comes down to it. And if you look at the top evokers out there that are, you know, not preservation, the top augmentations are just swapping to Devastation here and there. I don't see Devastation climbing as higher than B tier at the moment. Maybe they need a bigger buff, because even if you look at their overall performance, it's still pretty low compared to the, I guess, the A tier specs, which is why it is in B tier. Similarly with Elemental, Elemental is still a solid spec. It's around B tier. It's doing really well, kind of the same as Devastation. However, there is something good to say about Elemental, where it doesn't seem like it relies that heavily on Augmentation. Now, don't get me wrong, Augmentation is pretty good for everybody, but if you really look at the log that we have right now on the screen, this is like an overall performance in Everbloom by an Elemental Shaman with a Devastation, with not a Devastation, with an Augmentation in their group, and it did pretty good numbers. But there's also one without Augmentation, still Everbloom, and it's still doing pretty good numbers, and their eye levels are relatively similar, their overall damage is relatively similar, so it doesn't feel like Augmentation impacts Elemental's performance that much. Obviously, it's better with than without. However, you might maybe want a third actual DPS in your group instead of an Augmentation, although if you do have something like a Havoc in your group, your Augmentation is probably going to do a lot better. But you can rejoice if you're playing Elemental. You don't really feel like you need to be like, oh my god, if I don't play with an Augmentation, I cannot push keys. Clearly not the case. And we're down to the last one, Shadow Priest. Now, there's a couple of things that need to be said about Shadow. It is B tier, it's close to A tier, and there are a couple of reasons why it is not A tier, and it's kind of very hard to point out. Now, Shadow Priest is doing really good numbers for the average sense. Like, if you look at this Everbloom log right now, it's over 200k overall, which is a good overall, but it's clearly behind the other specs in its group. Similarly with Murazon's Rise, it's doing okay-ish overall, but very low behind it. So you might think, but why is Shadow Priest in B tier and not in C tier-ish, where kind of it seems like it has Destro Warlock numbers? Well, that's probably because of Power Infusion. Power Infusion is just very strong, and it's looking like Power Infusion might even be better paired up with Augmentation, because if you look at this particular log with wow, this is like the only Shadow Priest log that I have found. There might be others that I might have missed, but this is the only Shadow Priest that I've seen that does this much damage. And just look, it's out DPSing an enhancement. Sure, the difference in skill is apparent. The enhancement has overall lower parts. The enhancement can potentially dish way more damage than this Shadow Priest, but it's not. But for some reason, most of the logs of Shadow without Augmentation are just very mediocre, but once you put an Augmentation in, dude, this spec blasts. However, it is no surprise to say that Shadow Priest unfortunately has been nerfed a little bit too much. I think every Shadow Priest main knows this, and I know everybody wants their spec to perform to the best of their ability, but, you know, I think the fact that Power Infusion just brings it up to par with all of these specs is a good thing, at least going for Shadow Priest. And overall, this is kind of how the tier list is looking. And if you want a more rounded listed distribution of the specs, you can probably look at the overall Season 3 rankings that you can probably find on websites like Subcreation, where it's kind of like similar still, but probably more of the performance that you might have seen in the dungeon, since not everybody has gotten their tier set. Although this week the performance is clearly way better, since we can probably assume that the people that are pushing 24s, if they 24s, 25s, 26s keys, if they didn't have their 4 set last week, which most of them probably did, then they do have it this week. And if you really want to see all of the A tier specs that I mentioned, probably except Arcane, I think they're all ranked S tier into subcreation this week. They're all really, really, really good. This is the most S tier specs I have seen in a while, but the overall, there might still be a difference between augmentation and the rest. And we talked so much about how good Havoc is, and you've seen all of the logs today with Havoc. We also have a melee tier list for Mythic Plus that you can check right now with the kind of first iteration of the meta, although it seems to kind of still be the same. Anyway, you can just check it out and click it right here on the screen and go have some melee tier list fun.